If we look at U.S. policies, practices, and perspectives through this lens, we see first that depicting American Indians as warlike or wandering savages was not simply the product of ignorance or prejudice. The founders' own documentation demonstrates that they knew better. But racially constructing indigenous people in this way rationalized the invaders' seemingly contradictory claims that the lands they occupied were both vacant and legitimately obtained by conquest. There were, of course, hundreds of massacres in which men, women, children, and elders were indiscriminately killed, entire villages burned, crops destroyed. Scalp bounties were issued in every state and territory, making Indian killing a profitable venture for those pioneers our children are taught to admire. The indigenous population was decimated by infectious diseases, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes deliberately introduced, and mortality rates of 50% or higher predictably attended forced removals and internments. And even after all this, as recently as the 1970s, a massive family planning campaign by the Indian Health Service resulted in a 50% drop in the average number of children born to American Indian women.
My name is Daniel Canstrom. I'm a professor of law here at Boston College, the co-director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. It's my great honor and pleasure to briefly welcome you and to introduce tonight's speaker on behalf of myself and my co-director, Professor Brinton Likes, oh, there she is, yes, who was actually scheduled to do this introduction, but who had an unfortunate slip and fall from which she is equally fortunately recovering quickly, but not yet completely. So I'm Plan B. I want to thank Professor Jim Smith, as well as our Assistant Director, Tim Karsh, and the many students and staff assistants who have worked assiduously to make trains run on time, ensure that microphones work, that PowerPoints load, and all the other techno and administrivia without which we would all be huddled around a fire with tonight's speakers somewhere in the remaining wilds of Newton or Chestnut Hill, looking for our reading glasses. And now it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Natsu Saito is Professor of Law Emerita at Georgia State University, where she has taught public international law, international human rights, race and the law, federal Indian law and indigenous rights, and professional responsibility. Her scholarship has focused on American exceptionalism and international law, the legal history of race in the United States, the so-called plenary power doctrine as applied to immigrants, American Indians, and U.S. territorial possessions, and the human rights implications of U.S. governmental policies, particularly with regard to the suppression of political dissent. She is the author of 3 books and some 50 articles or book chapters. Her latest book is entitled Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law, Why Structural Racism Persists. It was published by NYU Press in 2020. If I may, as one who has labored in many of these fields as well for some years, assure you that Professor Saito's work has long been important, creative, thought-provoking, influential, and well-respected. After receiving her JD from Yale Law School, Professor Saito worked for various law firms. As a member of the Georgia Bar, she has served on the Committee on the Involvement of Women and Minorities in the Profession, the Georgia Supreme Court's Commission on Racial and Ethnic Bias in the Courts. She helped found the Georgia chapter of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association and has served on the boards of the Conference of Asian Pacific American Law Professors, the Paideia School, the Metro Atlanta Task Force for the Homeless, and the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee, as well as the Board of Governors of the Society of American Law Teachers. She was co-director of the Human Rights Research Fund and an expert consultant to the Human Rights Council, special rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, and a scholarly advisor to the National Japanese American Historical Society. She currently serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Law and Political Economy and the advisory board of the Third World Approaches to International Law Review. Please join me in offering our heartiest welcome to Professor Saito.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here tonight. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Dan. And I appreciate everybody taking the time to come out here on what I know is the night before a break. I'm really grateful to the Lowell Humanities Series, the Center for Human Rights and International Justice, the Forum on Racial Justice for sponsoring this talk, and for everyone who made it possible. It's really an honor to be with you tonight. I'm humbled to be here on what I understand is land of the Massachusetts people. Land acknowledgements, I know, like any form of redress, can be counterproductive. But for reasons that I hope will become clear, I think it's critical to take the notion of being grounded quite literally, paying attention to the history and the spirits of the land that we're on at any given time, wherever we are. I'm excited to be here for several reasons. My very first presentation as a legal academic was here at BC in 1994 at the first gathering of what became the Conference of Asian Pacific American Law Professors. And I'm really happy to be able to talk about my book in person because it was published in March 2020. So this is like the first time I've actually gotten to do it at an in-person gathering. And mostly I'm really grateful to be part of a symposium that's exploring structural racism and redress in the context of migration, Indigenous peoples' rights, and the ongoing dynamics of settler colonization. Tomorrow's sessions are going to be incredible. And I hope that what I'm going to cover tonight will lay a little bit of foundation for the discussions that I think tomorrow we'll be able to go into much greater depth with. In anticipation of those sessions, I'd like to talk about 4 general things. And that's why settler colonialism as an interpretive lens can help us see the common structural drivers of the various forms of racism and xenophobia that we encounter in the United States, to understand why prioritizing Indigenous sovereignty is essential to remediating structural racism, to identify forms of redress that are empowering, and to envision truly liberatory alternatives to a system that has proven incapable of ensuring our freedom, equality, or basic human rights. Following the trajectory of the book, I'll start by looking briefly at where we are now and why our stories about how we got here matter. After a brief look at what we mean by settler colonialism, I'll share a few examples of how that lens can help us to see patterns that cut across our diverse histories. And finally, I'll turn to why this matters, why at least I'm energized by a path that leads not just to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but decolonization and self-determination. So I want to start with a little bit of what Derek Bell called racial realism. We know that better worlds are possible, and to achieve them, we need to be clear about what's wrong and how it got to be this way. Tracing the problem to its source takes us to structural rather than cosmetic solutions. Michel Foucault called this historical genealogy, but you don't really have to be a French philosopher to make this point. In the 1980s, Lakota elder Matthew King analogized political struggle to a journey across the northern plains. He said, "You have to look back over your shoulder periodically because to know how to get to where you want to go, you first have to know where you are. And to know where you are, you always have to know where you've been." So we begin with where we are. It's scary to acknowledge the harsh realities of life on this planet today. Unprecedented heat waves, massive floods, species disappearing at mind-boggling rates force us to confront the catastrophic environmental destruction that we've triggered. Migrants dying of hunger and thirst, their children washed up on beaches or held in cages, reflect the arbitrary and inhumane nature of territorial state borders. The resurgence of white supremacy, accompanied by racist and xenophobic violence, reminds us that this is anything but a post-racial world. And we see around us every day the effects of apparently intractable racial and gender disparities in income, wealth, housing, education, healthcare, as well as incarceration rates and police killings. It can be kind of overwhelming. I expect you've seen the statistics. What's harder to grasp is that in most respects, it's not actually getting better. Over the past century, we've seen mass movements for social change, from socialist revolutions and wars of independence to widespread popular uprisings for political inclusion and fundamental human rights. They've generated significant social and political change, but also remarkably effective resistance and retrenchment. Despite all the accomplishments of the civil rights era and the growing number of people of color in positions of political, military, and economic power, the continuing reality of racialized privilege in the United States is evidenced by virtually all measures of socioeconomic well-being. So just a couple of examples. Black-white income and wealth gaps are as large now as they were in 1968. Since 1972, the prison population has grown sixfold, and racial disparities in incarceration persist and in some cases are increasing. Those who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native remain overall the poorest racial group in the United States, and their dispossession accounts for the fact recently announced by the CDC that with the drop of over 6 years during the pandemic, Native children now have the same life expectancy that the, quote, average American had in 1944. All this is happening more than 150 years after the 14th Amendment guaranteed us equal protection and due process, more than 60 years after the Civil Rights Movement. And yet, most of us still cling to the belief that our underlying institutions are fundamentally equitable, democratic, and life-enhancing, or that they can become so. I think we do this, despite all evidence to the contrary, because it's so hard to envision alternate responses. It seems that if we don't insist that things are getting better, just very slowly, we'll be conceding that racism and other forms of oppression are inevitably part of human nature. But the racial realism that the late Derek Bell insisted was the key to our survival tells us that if we're to make meaningful change, we're going to have to let go of the very Western notion of inevitable progress and instead consider how, as Dorothy Roberts puts it, we rectify a system that so brilliantly serves its intended purpose. We can begin with our narratives of origin, our stories of who we are, where we've come from, where we're going, what we fear, what we want, and how we should try to attain it. They can convince us that the status quo is natural and inevitable, or they can open up a world of transformative possibilities. The dominant narrative highlights the Anglo-American founding fathers not as colonizers, but as righteously resisting British colonial rule in their quest for democratic governance and religious freedom. It sanitizes the violence, exploitation, and environmental destruction that created our contemporary world. Gross violations of fundamental human rights are relegated to a past for which no one is today responsible, dismissed as the inevitable growing pains of a state that would come to represent the apex of Western civilization. For many of us, this hegemonic narrative rings hollow because we see or live in the alternate histories and grim realities that it erases. We recognize the importance of accounting for the experiences of all peoples without dismissing their hardships as anomalies or resorting to exceptionalism. If such narratives didn't matter, we wouldn't be seeing the backlash that has generated book bans, attacks on critical race theory, the dramatic constriction of curricular offerings that we see today. We know, too, that legal, political, and economic systems are mutually constitutive, and we see how they perpetuate subordination and inequality. But this doesn't necessarily tell us why they work the way they do or how they can best be deconstructed. To address structural racism in a meaningful way, we need to ask why racism and xenophobia persist. Why did the founding fathers believe it necessary to kill as many indigenous people as possible and drive the rest off their lands? What motivated the enslavement of millions of Africans as well as American Indians? Why have Latinx and Asian peoples been encouraged to migrate and then summarily excluded or deported? And why are the dynamics that fueled these developments still alive and well today? What functions do they continue to serve? These are the inquiries that led me to the framework of settler colonialism. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s. I'm old. When the liberatory potential of a new world order was palpable. Independent African states emerged from colonial rule each year. Anti-colonial struggles and mass movements against military dictatorships were succeeding in Asia and Latin America as well, inspiring student and youth uprisings throughout Europe and North America. As Adolfo Gili said in his introduction to Frantz Fanon's Studies in a Dying Colonialism, The whole of humanity has erupted violently, tumultuously onto the stage of history, taking its own destiny into its hands. It was a time of tremendous energy and hope for activists in the U.S. As Iris Morales and Denise Oliver Velez of the Puerto Rican Young Lords put it, we woke up each day to serve the people, and at night we dreamed about the new society that we would create, convinced that the richest country on the globe had sufficient resources to make a better world. In researching this book, I thought a lot about what could bring that spark of light back into the eyes of the young people I saw in my community and in my classes. I remembered that many of the groups that inspired me considered racial oppression to be a function of internal colonialism, and I wondered why, outside of indigenous circles, I rarely heard anyone talk in those terms anymore. Eventually, I concluded that it could be attributed in part to the social and political repression that decimated the most radical challenges to the status quo. But I also think it was because we focused on classic or external colonialism that had characterized European expansion into Asia and Africa. This was a useful analogy, but there are many aspects of American racial hierarchy that only make sense, I think, if we view the United States as a different kind of colonial power, a settler colonial state. Once I started thinking about it like that, so much about our histories, both shared and very diverse, fell into place for me. So I'd like to share briefly with you, because I know some people are really familiar with the concept of settler colonialism, but others aren't, just a little bit about what we mean when we talk about settler colonialism. Generally speaking, right, the colonialism of the past 500 years has involved the exploitation of land, labor, and natural resources by people or entities, generally states that are not indigenous to the territory at issue, and the imposition of economic, political, and social institutions to facilitate that exploitation. It claims a civilizing mission, described by Anthony Angie as the grand project that has justified colonialism as a means of redeeming the backward, aberrant, violent, oppressed, undeveloped people of the non-European world by incorporating them into the universal civilization of Europe. This redemption becomes the rationale for eradicating the cultures, languages, and histories of those being colonized, as well as their structures of self-governance. It is that intent to erase the identity of a people as such, as a people, that led Jean-Paul Sartre to conclude that colonialism is inherently genocidal. Maintaining colonialism requires what Angie calls the dynamic of difference, a, quote, process of creating a gap between two cultures, demarcating one as universal and civilized, and the other as particular and uncivilized, and seeking to bridge the gap by normalizing the aberrant society. Among other things, this leads to the construction of racial classifications that facilitate the colonial project. Continued colonial rule is only justified to the extent that civilization is being promoted, and therefore the colonized must be kept perpetually inferior. In classic or external European colonialism, the colonizers typically claimed land, exploited the labor and natural resources of those who lived there, sent the profits back to the mother country, and ultimately returned home themselves. By contrast, in a settler state, the colonizers come to stay. They reject control by the metropolitan center, presuming instead their own prerogative to establish their state on somebody else's land, to create social, political, legal, and economic institutions solely for their own benefit, and to determine who may not, or must live within their claimed boundaries. This is why anthropologist Patrick Wolfe famously described settler colonialism as a structure, not an event. The United States has maintained external colonies, but it is first and foremost a settler state. Because the colonizers came to stay, controlling land was their first priority and remains a foundational principle. But the territory, of course, was occupied by people who, as Deborah Bird Rose put it, got in the way just by staying home. What we now call North America It was home to hundreds of nations with highly developed cosmologies and cultures, extensive agricultural production, complex systems of governance, extensive networks of trade and communication. But the early Anglo-American settlers couldn't envision systems of shared land tenure and governance, and they were unwilling to adapt to extant indigenous polities. As a result, the elimination of native peoples became essential to their mission. If we look at U.S. policies, practices, and perspectives through this lens, we see first that depicting American Indians as warlike or wandering savages was not simply the product of ignorance or prejudice. The founders' own documentation demonstrates that they knew better. But racially constructing indigenous people in this way rationalized the invaders' seemingly contradictory claims that the lands they occupied were both vacant and legitimately obtained by conquest. There were, of course, hundreds of massacres in which men, women, children, and elders were indiscriminately killed, entire villages burned, crops destroyed. Scalp bounties were issued in every state and territory, making Indian killing a profitable venture for those pioneers our children are taught to admire. The indigenous population was decimated by infectious diseases, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes deliberately introduced, and mortality rates of 50% or higher predictably attended forced removals and internments. And even after all this, as recently as the 1970s, a massive family planning campaign by the Indian Health Service resulted in a 50% drop in the average number of children born to American Indian women in the decade of the 1970s. I've long known that women of my generation, I've long known women of my generation who were involuntarily sterilized, and often without even being informed. But I still find it really chilling to think that our children's generation, in terms of Native folks, would be twice as big as it is now. That's just, it's really mind-boggling to think about that. We've also seen strategies of conceptual disappearance, such as the arbitrary blood quantum requirements that have been used by the federal government since the 1880s to shrink the federally recognized American Indian population and its land base. All of this reinforces the notion that Indians have disappeared. Just think about how often you've heard American Indians referenced in the past tense. And if you don't do anything else, right, as a result of thinking about this, just call it out when you hear people doing it, because it still happens so often. And this notion of disappearance is also an attempt to erase indigeneity itself by collapsing innumerable polities and cultures into a single racial identity, thereby transforming nations into minority groups that have the right to be incorporated into mainstream society, but not necessarily to be recognized as sovereign. A final point I'd like to make here, and one that applies to all of us, is that racialization can lead, somewhat counterintuitively, to the nullification of identity. And that's because once the race problem is constructed as a problem of difference, the race solution becomes the elimination of difference. Assimilationism has been a key strategy of settler colonialism, because if native peoples can be disappeared into the general population, their land claims and their challenges to settler hegemony also disappear. This explains a lot about why settler society outlawed indigenous cultural and spiritual practices, undermined traditional modes of governance, forced Indian children into boarding schools, terminated parental rights, and unilaterally declared American Indians to be U.S. citizens. Ultimately, assimilation requires not only that those deemed other conform, but a willingness on the part of mainstream society to absorb them. This rarely happens because difference is what maintains settler privilege. In the meantime, however, as Lorenzo Veracini notes, it allows indigenous people to be envisaged as only temporarily excluded and paves the way for vilifying or criminalizing those who fail to assimilate. This, he says, is crucial to the disavowal of the inherently political character of indigenous demands. Is it that exciting? Wow. The experiences of other people of color within the American settler state have been quite different. Nonetheless, if we think in terms of the perceived needs of settler colonial society, it becomes clear that the diverse ways in which we have been and continue to be racialized, exploited, and or forcibly excluded or included have common structural drivers, to borrow Tenzai Achume's term. As the settlers consolidated their control over indigenous territory, their priority became making it profitable. Their own labor being insufficient, they turned to enslaving both American Indians and Africans. This wasn't a new idea, for indigenous peoples had been enslaved by the Spanish since 1492, and by 1619, about 1 million enslaved Africans had already been brought to European colonies in the New World. Enslaved labor was essential to the colonial project. Thus, the preamble to South Carolina's 1696 slave code noted that the colony couldn't survive without, quote, the labor and service of Negroes and other slaves. And racialization provided the justification for the imposition of an entirely separate legal system on them, as, according to the preamble, those being enslaved were of such, quote, barbarous, wild, savage natures as to be wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of the colonizers. It's painful to look at the way the African slave trade and the institutions of chattel slavery operated, but doing so reveals the material and cultural losses systematically inflicted upon people by classic colonialism in Africa and internal colonization in the Americas. Moreover, understanding the extent to which enslaved labor provided the agricultural and industrial base for American empire is essential, I think, to any meaningful campaign for redress. Africans, of course, came to the Americas from hundreds of different indigenous societies, each with distinctive cultural, religious, political, and legal traditions. From the settlers' perspectives, these languages, cultures, and identities had to be eliminated if they were to control the labor force. So even though the colonizers wanted to make American Indians disappear and the Afro-descendant population expand, both were ultimately subjected to what Ngugi wa Thiong'o calls the cultural bomb of colonialism. Beginning in the mid-1600s, the Anglo-American colonies instituted perpetual hereditary slavery and denied all civil and political rights to persons of African descent. As Justice Taney noted in the Dred Scott case, persons of African descent were, quote, bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. Profit, of course, is the key here, and it explains much about why black as a racial classification was defined as expansively as possible, whereas restrictive definitions of racial identity were imposed on those who might have land claims. Following the formal abolition of slavery in 1866, slave codes were replaced by black codes, which criminalized much of the black population for activities such as idleness, vagrancy, or disrespect of white people, while fueling a system of convict labor that served essentially the same purposes as chattel slavery. By the mid-20th century, we'd seen a shift from the initial drive to create an ever-expanding labor force to the perception of black people as a surplus population to be contained and controlled. Considering the settlers' perceived labor needs, thus lends consistency and coherence to a history that moves from slavery to convict labor to our present carceral state. More generally, the motivations of the settler class explain a great deal about why abolishing American apartheid has not eliminated racial disparities and why integrationist visions are never realized. With respect to other people of color, we see variations on the themes of land, natural resources, and the desire for cheap, preferably disposable labor. Each community has its own narratives, of course, and we can only touch on a few here. While with the United States annexation of the northern half of Mexico, the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, and the so-called purchase of Alaska, we see the primacy of the settlers' drive for land and natural resources. In these territories and in external colonies, such as Puerto Rico and the Philippines, we also see the desire to control a global network of strategic locations considered vital to their economic and military ambitions. In each case, racialization was deployed to justify the colonizers' actions. Thus, for example, in the 1840s and 50s, Mexicans were depicted as, quote, indolent, slothful, cruel, and cowardly, a race unfit to govern their own land. The brutal war fought to pacify the Philippines 50 years later was justified by depicting Filipinos as savage headhunters, jungle folk who would attack at any provocation. As the United States expanded its territorial base, it prioritized the development of labor that was both easily accessed and exploited and readily disposed of. In California, for example, scalp bounties and massacres were utilized to clear the land of its indigenous owners, and Chinese labor then imported to render it habitable and profitable. One of the interesting little factoids I learned is that by 1870, Chinese workers, who were almost exclusively men, made up 9% of California's population, but 25% of its workforce. From 1852 to 1870, taxes on foreign miners, actually defined as any worker of Mexican or Chinese descent, they didn't actually have to be mining, these taxes generated between 1/4 and 1/2 of California's state revenue. And those who couldn't pay were sentenced to build roads or otherwise provide free labor for the state, much as black convict labor was used in the South following the abolition of slavery. These exploitative labor practices were facilitated by social, economic, and political segregation, criminalization, and violent racial attacks, and of course by the constant reinforcement of racial stereotypes. Thus, in 1854, the California Supreme Court held that Chinese witnesses couldn't testify against white people in court because they constituted degraded tribes who have nothing in common with us. Nothing in common with us. This is the foundational premise for constructing those of Mexican, Central American, Asian, or Middle Eastern origin as intrinsically foreign, people with no legitimate claim to the benefits of settler society. Until 1952, the law restricted naturalized citizenship on the basis of race, and of course we still encounter the nothing in common presumption in what seem to be never-ending cycles of exclusionary immigration laws, policies, and practices. As Chinese labor became superfluous in the 1870s and 80s, the federal government implemented its first immigration restrictions. These were upheld in the Chinese exclusion cases, where the Supreme Court explained that the state's sovereign prerogative gave it absolute authority to control those who could enter or remain within its claimed territorial boundaries, regardless of otherwise applicable constitutional constraints. Known as the plenary power doctrine, this has also allowed the state's virtually unlimited exercise of jurisdiction over American Indian nations as well as external colonies. One of my favorite quotes comes from a 1901 case in which the Supreme Court held that constitutional protections did not apply in unincorporated territories such as Puerto Rico. And of course, we still see, right, with what's happening in Puerto Rico, that this is the case. But in that case, Justice Brown, who just 5 years earlier had written the majority opinion upholding racial segregation in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, that same Justice Brown assured us that this decision in the Puerto Rico case wasn't going to result in despotism because, quote, there are certain principles of natural justice inherent in the Anglo-Saxon character which need no expression in constitutions or statutes to give them effect or to secure dependencies against legislation manifestly hostile to their real interests. It's hard to imagine a more explicitly colonial framing, but this is still the foundational legal principle governing externally colonized peoples, indigenous nations, and immigration law. So why do we care? I've been energized by this framing because policies and practices that seem aberrational or contradictory or simply mean-spirited begin to make sense structurally when viewed as a function of the settler imperative for land, labor, and social control. But does an explanation that might possibly be more coherent actually change anything? I'm going to wrap up this talk with 4 ways that I think it might enhance our struggles for justice. These fall under the general headings of interest convergence, distinguishing colonization from exploitation, remedies that empower, and dreaming big. So we start with converging interests. We actually start with some water. Okay. So first, a settler colonial framing illustrates that even as the how of racism and xenophobia in our communities may look very different, the why often reveals a common source. And this means that all of us who oppose racism or xenophobia have converging interests. It took me a while to really grasp this concept. My Japanese American family was interned during World War II, and I've always considered anti-Asian violence, as well as this country's willingness to incarcerate people en masse, as a very real threat. Living in the South made it clear to me that anti-Black racism not only permeates our social institutions and our consciousness, but reinforces anti-Asian and anti-immigrant sentiment as well. And as I learned about the history of African Americans in the land I was living on in Georgia, as well as the impact of U.S. imperialism, it finally dawned on me that structural racism here, as well as the United States' status as a global superpower, rests still on the occupation of native lands and the wealth generated by enslaved and otherwise subordinated labor. And that meant to me that if I cared about any of those other issues, I had a critical interest in supporting indigenous sovereignty. Discussing race as a function of colonialism meets with considerable resistance in non-indigenous circles. Indigenous issues are generally cabined in their own sphere, while broader conversations about racism either ignore Native people altogether or at best include them as just another minority. Do y'all remember during the 2020 election, CNN was reporting on election results, and it classified voters as white, Latinx, Black, Asian, or, quote, something else. But if racialized power and privilege in the United States today are rooted in the ongoing colonization of Native North America, decolonization is in the interest not only of indigenous nations and people, but all people of color, and I expect a large majority of those who identify as white. In addition, by calling into question the legitimacy of states and their claimed borders, this perspective allows us to advocate for migrant rights without reinforcing a myth that I consider quite pernicious, that this is a nation of immigrants. Derek Bell argued that we only see progress toward racial justice when there's a perceived convergence of interest. When we take settler colonial dynamics into account, we see alignments that allow us to come together, not just because we want to be good allies, but because it's our struggle too. My second and related point is that from this perspective, discrimination and exploitation are serious concerns, but they're not the root of the problem. And this is a significant and potentially controversial point because it distinguishes a lot of what are seen as sort of leftist perspectives from those that center indigeneity. In the late 1960s, Black Power activist Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, insisted that if we want to address structural racism in this society, we have to acknowledge it as a settler colony. Viewing integration and assimilation as intended to abolish the cultural integrity of African American communities, he said, "What must be abolished is not the Black community, but the dependent colonial status that has been inflicted upon it." One of his key insights, I think, was that, quote, "the exploited and the colonized move in different paths. Because both are oppressed, their material conditions may look similar. Colonized peoples, however, are not only economically subordinated, but, quote, their culture, their values, their language, their entire way of life are stripped from them, and they're forced to identify with the oppressor. Economic exploitation can be remedied, at least theoretically, by redistributing resources, by ensuring access to housing, healthcare, education, or employment, by eliminating racial and gender disparities, as well as discrimination based on nationality or immigration status. I don't think any of this is likely to happen in a settler state, but even if it were possible, there'd still be two fundamental problems. First, a more equitable distribution of stolen goods is not justice. We just have a lot more colonizers. And second, it wouldn't rectify what Ngugi wa Thiong'o describes as the most problematic aspect of colonial rule, the cultural bomb that annihilates a people's belief in who they are, eventually making them want to identify with that which is furthest removed from themselves. to the extent that the path of the exploited focuses primarily on more equitable distributions of wealth and power, it can be accommodated within the parameters of the Western colonial paradigm. That's why we could emerge from the civil rights movement and the urban rebellions of the 1960s with minimally expanded access to mainstream institutions, but without redress for historic injustices or any real structural change. Rather than reparations for centuries of dispossession, enslavement, and apartheid, we got a war on poverty, which soon devolved into a war on crime and our current situation of mass incarceration. We also see this on a global scale, where the most powerful states have avoided genuine decolonization by attributing the devastating consequences of colonial rule to poverty and prescribing development as the ever-elusive cure. But that's kind of another story. So this gets me to my third point, which is that different ways of framing the problem lead us to very different remedial options. The dominant narrative tells us that our Constitution and laws ensure fundamental rights and freedoms, that because we no longer have structural barriers to progress, racial disparities and prejudices are simply vestiges of a bygone era. This narrative cannot account for the patterns of exclusion, elimination, and subordination that persist, notwithstanding the legal mandates of our Constitution and laws. It ignores the fact that there are large sectors of the population, notably migrants and the most directly colonized, to whom constitutional protections in many cases simply do not apply. And it relies on an assimilationist, even if multicultural, framing that renders indigenous sovereignty invisible and makes racially subordinated people believe their interests are aligned with those of the state. There's no room in the master narrative to address the harm wrought by colonization. And while there's no blueprint for decolonizing a settler state, international law gives us a good starting point. The international legal system, like domestic law, remains tightly controlled by those who wield state power. As a result, it tends to perpetuate colonial relations within and among states. Nonetheless, international law goes well beyond U.S. law in its interpretation of fundamental human rights, its very broad prohibition of racial discrimination, and its recognition of the unique status and rights of indigenous peoples. It also recognizes that all peoples have a right to self-determination, and that, quote, by virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. All peoples have this right. Rob Williams summarizes self-determination as, quote, the idea that human beings, individually and as groups, should be in control of their own destiny, and that systems of government should be devised accordingly and not imposed upon them by alien domination. According to the UN Human Rights Committee, it's an essential condition for the realization of all individual human rights. International law has a broad conception of redress and reparations as well. In the US, we generally presume that money is the best remedy for legally cognizable injuries. By contrast, under international law, reparation must, as far as possible, wipe out all consequences of the illegal act and reestablish the situation which would have existed if the act had not been committed, to quote a 1928 opinion of the Permanent Court of International Justice. If such restitution is not possible, then we look to compensation and other measures. In 2005, the UN General Assembly issued its basic principles and guidelines on redress for the most serious kinds of human rights violations. These encompass, as a matter of course, restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. The nature of the wrong dictates the appropriate remedy, and the perpetrator does not get to decide the form or extent of this remedy. This framing gives us the tools to address not only dispossession, but also the long-term trauma that has been inflicted by a social order built on genocide, the theft of lands and resources, and the kidnapping, forced relocation, and enslavement of peoples. Is the international legal system capable of effectuating these remedies for us? Clearly not. But they let us see what we know at a gut level to be justice correlates to what's recognized at some level as law. And that, I think, is an empowering realization. I think it's empowering for us, and I think it's empowering for the people we work with when we do human rights work. In thinking about this, I always come back to Robert Cover's reminder that, quote, "The position that only the state creates law confuses the status of interpretation with the status of political domination." He says, "We ought to stop circumscribing the nomos and invite new worlds." And that brings me to what is really my final point. As Robin Kelly tells us, the map to a new world is in the imagination, in what we see in our third eyes rather than in the desolation that surrounds us. We can step outside the presumptions of Western civilization that permeate our consciousness. We don't have to see this as a singular universe, one in which humanness is defined by its distinction from nature, a hierarchical order in which everything and everyone has their place, and human history is a linear narrative of progress from savagery to civilization, or development, as we prefer to call it these days. We have to acknowledge the power of race, gender, property, and state sovereignty in our lives today, but we can see that they're social constructs defined to make colonial relations of power and privilege seem right, natural, and inevitable. We don't have to accept their legitimacy or define ourselves in their terms. We can learn about the multiplicity of worldviews that, thankfully, still exist, and consider reconstructing relationships in terms of balance, renewal, and genuine sustainability. Do we still have to struggle for basic human rights, to try every day to get people out of cages, resist racialized violence and exclusion, expand access to nutritious food and clean water, fight book bans and all the other attempts to erase our stories? Of course. Our dignity, our humanity, and our survival depend on it. But we can understand and assess these struggles somewhat differently. We can look not only at whether we've managed to curtail discrimination or state violence or physical and cultural dispossession, but also at how we're doing so. The beautiful thing about self-determination is that while we'd like the state to acknowledge the right, its exercise is not contingent on state approval. Self-determination is a continuing right, not an event, but a process, and people can assert some level of control over their destinies under almost any circumstance. I love Justice Amun's emphasis on agency in the International Court of Justice's 1971 Namibia case. In that case, South Africa argued that colonization had erased Namibia's legal standing, but Amun insisted that, quote, "The Namibian people asserted its international personality by taking up the struggle for freedom. Sovereignty," he continued, "is inherent in every people, just as liberty is inherent in every human being, and therefore it did not cease to belong to the people as a result of their colonization. Rather, quote, it had simply for a time been rendered inarticulate and deprived of freedom of expression." Mindful of the fact that we're on indigenous lands and that colonization has not extinguished indigenous sovereignty, there are many ways to further our collective decolonization. Some involve contesting the legitimacy of the state itself. Others may seem far removed from structural transformation. But the question, I think, is whether any given effort ultimately reinforces the hegemonic power of the state or undermines it by empowering the people. To return to Stokely Carmichael again, he went to jail dozens of times for defending the right of Black people in the South to vote, even though he didn't believe that voting would bring about meaningful social change. When asked about this, he said, "The act of registering to vote gives one a sense of being. The Black man who goes to register is saying to the white man, 'You have said that I cannot vote. You have said that this is my place where I should remain. You have contained me, and I am saying no to your containment.'" There are many ways that we can say no, or support those who are saying no to containment, and to those who go on to develop creative ways of securing and providing for their communities. Over the past decade, we've had a lot of examples of such opportunities. In 2016, over 10,000 people, including some 3,000 veterans, traveled to Standing Rock, North Dakota, to join Indigenous water protectors contesting the construction of an oil pipeline that's sure to result in environmental harm. Standing Rock provided a remarkable demonstration of people's willingness to come together from so many backgrounds, not only to defend the water and its indigenous protectors, but to create spontaneously a community that was quite literally off the grid. And of course, we've seen the power of the movement for Black Lives and the global wave of demonstrations against state-sponsored racial violence. For a minute, defunding the police and acknowledging institutional racism actually became legitimate topics of discussion. There's been backlash as well, of course, but even that backlash tells us that these movements were significant enough to be perceived as real threats to the status quo. In every community, there are always struggles that we can join or support or defend. There was an amazing window in the early months of the pandemic when we recognized collectively that universal health care is in everyone's interest, that mass incarceration really isn't necessary, just who is an essential worker and how much we can accomplish with independent mutual aid groups. I think we may have let that one slip away. But my point is that there are always opportunities to contest colonial structures of power and privilege. And in thinking about how to direct our energies, to me, the most important question is whether any given effort empowers or disempowers those who have been dispossessed. So, in conclusion, I'd like to say that the devastation we see around us is not simply the collateral damage of an otherwise beneficial world order, the price worth paying for the marvels of progress. Rather, it's the direct and entirely foreseeable consequence of more than 5 centuries of colonization and imperial expansion. Wolf's powerful observation that settler colonial invasion is a structure, not an event, tells us that the decolonizing of settler society will most likely not be an event, but a process, or most probably many processes, of restructuring. We can't predict the particular forms decolonization will take because self-determination, by definition, can't be legislated from above or directed by well-intentioned outsiders. We can, however, facilitate the process by refusing to allow our imaginations to be constrained by colonial presumptions, by supporting the right of all peoples to self-determination, and by being willing to imagine society beyond the bounds of state sovereignty. We can defend those attempting to decolonize their communities, even when we might disagree with some of their positions or their tactics. Is it utopian to contemplate paths that might lead us toward legal, political, or economic formations unconstrained by state power and conceived outside the linear, universalizing, hierarchical perspectives imposed on us by colonial rule? Probably. But no more utopian than believing that we can meaningfully address racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, economic exploitation, or environmental catastrophe within the bounds of what we're told is possible. In the epilogue to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, the protagonist says, "If you don't know where you are, you probably don't know who you are." And with that thought in mind, I'd like to close by bringing us back to the importance of where we are and who we are in relation to these lands and peoples. Thank you.
So, Professor Saito, you'll take some questions?
Yes, I'll try.
Perfect. So, Chandler and I have 4 mics. We're happy to bring the mic to you if you just raise your hand, and we're happy to take questions after such a wonderful talk.
Or maybe I've answered them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saito. My question is about the point about the right to self-determination. Right now in the world, we have so many unrecognized nations. To use an uncontroversial example, we can think about, Catalonia's attempt to secede from Spain a few years ago. There's very heavy criticism of these efforts, and often the word sovereignty is used somehow paradoxically to say, well, what about the sovereignty of Spain? I'm wondering how you can comment on these paradoxes about sovereignty with respect to the right to self-determination. Thank you.
Yes, that's a really good and really important point. And of course, we see that reflected here too, with the United States government saying it has the sovereign right to determine all these things. And American Indian nations are just as sovereign as we let them be. Like, they're sovereign enough to give up their resources, but not sovereign enough to actually, have jurisdiction over people on their lands or whatever. But that is really important. And I think that you make a really good distinction between states and nations. I really like Bernard Nietzsche's distinguishing of those, where he talks about states as being sort of civil political entities as we know them in international law, right, with defined territories and populations and recognized by other states as such, et cetera. Whereas nations are correlated in international law to peoples who have common identities, cultures, heritages, particular ties generally to certain land. And according to Nietzsche, who wrote this several decades ago, but I'm pretty sure it's still true, there are about 200 states in the world today, right? Like countries, those maps we all colored when we were in elementary school. But some 5,000 to 8,000 recognized nations. So if you think about those numbers, right, that means that there's lots and lots of nations within almost every state. And it's tricky because international law, while it recognizes the right of peoples to self-determination, it's also the law that is being made by states. And so it's very much in the interest of states. And if you think about it, almost all states are either former colonial powers or formerly colonized states that then, in many cases, inherited the boundaries imposed by colonial powers that encompass many, many different nations, and those states it is still in the interest of those states to maintain those boundaries and to keep those nations encapsulated, as Henry Richardson says. And so international law is being made by those entities in whose interest it is to only recognize the legitimacy of states, and yet it has been forced through the sort of decolonization era to recognize the right of peoples to self-determination. So there's a lot of tension there, and I don't think international law is going to resolve that for us for a long time until we've managed to get more entities involved in the process than just states. But it does make it confusing. And from my perspective, we just have to sort of decide whose story we're going to go with, right? Do we want to go with the ones in power, and adopt their narrative, or are we going to go with, the right of peoples to self-determination, and think about what that means? And, that's a scary thing, right? Because people get really freaked out when you talk about, these states are all going to be breaking up and, there's going to be chaos and anarchy. And, for one thing, that's a very limited historical perspective, right? I mean, states as we know them haven't been around for that long. If you just look back, look at a map of the world at the time of World War I, right before the Second World War, right? I mean, most of it was, in those eras were colonies. And the UN building, when they first formed the UN, there were 51 states, I think, and they only built the facilities to accommodate like 75 countries because that's all they anticipated, right? And now we have 200. So, I mean, there's been lots of change. Look what happened to the Soviet Union. All sorts of, changes like this occur all the time. But it's hard to face the uncertainty of those transitions, I think. But, to me, that's one of the reasons why looking at the sort of racial realism piece I started with is really important. Like, it's easy for us in our comfort, right? The fact that we're here sitting in this really beautiful place tonight, tells us that we have a certain comfort level in our lives that we're probably not anxious to give up. But if you look at the lives of so many people, right, who are just barely struggling. I mean, you look at people in all sorts of countries around the world, but also, on Pine Ridge Reservation, right? I mean, where, the life expectancy is like that of a third world, and, in the winter sometimes there's 80 and 90% unemployment. I mean, change would be okay, right? It's not, people always say, well, it could get so much worse. And it's like, really? I don't really think so, I mean, in certain respects it can get worse, but I think we really need to sort of try to keep a perspective on what we're talking about when we say, ooh, it could be so bad.
Other questions? I saw this lady here, and then I'll come over.
Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. My question is similar. I really loved, after you quoted Robin Kelly, we don't have to define ourselves in their terms. I've been thinking about that a lot too. And what terms, other terms we could use to make claims. And I was thinking especially, you use the language of self-determination and sovereignty a lot. And to me, those terms come from a very Western philosophical tradition of the natural law, natural rights of man, John Locke, life, liberty, property, sovereignty in the Magna Carta. I guess I'm just saying that these terms of sovereignty and self-determination to me do seem like their terms. It seems like you find something to be reclaimed or something generative about those terms. And I'm wondering what you see in those terms that do come from a Western philosophical tradition, but you're trying to repurpose. And if you didn't have those terms, I guess my second part is, what other terms might be possible to make claims that don't rely on the Western tradition?
That's a great question. And you have totally called out the fact that I am a recovering lawyer. Right? So I think in those terms, right? Like, how do we work within the box to further, look, even your law says, right, that we have these rights, that we have, because I think defensively we have to use that, and we have to employ any tools that are available to us. But you're absolutely right. The sovereignty and self-determination, as we understand those terms generally, are very, very Western concepts. And I would love to have a much different perspective. And I can't say that I have been able to, like, sit in my office and come up with in my head a different one, right? But I do know from the interactions I've had with many Indigenous scholars and communities that I see glimpses of them, right? I see ways of understanding the world where people don't define themselves in these very binary, narrow, exclusive classifications, right? And that's part of why the whole sort of Western civilization progress thing is significant here, is because if you have a hierarchically ordered universe, right, where there's linear progression, everybody has a place in a rank, and the objective is to go higher up that ladder. And if everybody has a place in a rank, then it makes sense, right, to think of people as being superior to animals, and within people that there must be classifications of people who are more and less significant, and to define genders as being either male or female, and generally females are defined as not men, right? Not powerful, not whatever, in this sort of the way cultural framework that we've absorbed around us. But you see, right, situations in which people don't have understandings of, well, these distinctions don't matter and they all blend together and we're all the same. That's one of the really dangerous things I think about sort of Western movements for equality is, I'm a woman and I'm oppressed, so I want to be just like a man, right? There's ways of understanding difference that promote harmony and balance and see people as having different roles and functions in society, with the goal always being not who can get ahead, but how do we work for the interest of society as a whole and for future generations and for all of our relatives, which includes every living thing, which includes like the rocks, right, as our oldest ancestors and the wisest, where we're like the youngest and most naive in this process, right? You can just sort of see like visions of everything that we've been told being sort of turned on their head. And so I think that's, those understandings hold really different perspectives. And that's why this whole notion of sort of a pluriverse is so important, because it doesn't mean we go in search of the perfect alternative, right? We start to understand that people over time and in different places have had really, really different understandings of the world, and we start to learn from that and to figure out what makes sense in any given situation, and how we can have identities that aren't, we don't have to pick just one box, check one box, right, of what your race or whatever, that we can have multiple overlapping identities, and that they can shift over time maybe, I don't know, right? And so, there's a lot of places we could go there, but I can't say I've done that work.
I think there was a question here.
Hello. One of the things you mentioned was about how the dominant colonial culture would try to eliminate differences that they saw. So what would you say about addressing forms of structural racism that we see today in our own communities, such as redlining, and how they manifest themselves?
Yes, there are, everywhere you look, right, there are those kinds of structural distinctions and imposition of hierarchies, if you will, based on race as well as, national origin or perception of, all sorts of other sort of dimensions of racism or xenophobia or gender bias or homophobia, whatever. And I think that we have to, like redlining is a great example, because that's been going on ever since the first settlers got here and said, here's the line and we're claiming it up to here and you have to live on the other side, right? In some form or another, we've seen that, and we still see it today going on in our communities. And I think that we just have to look at all these institutions, at every one of them, and see, like, if you look at an institution and you see a disparity, right? Like, supposedly we don't have mandated, legalized segregation of schools anymore. But in fact, schools are statistically more segregated now than they were when Brown versus Board of Education was decided. And just in terms of what kids are in what schools with what other kids, right? And so we have to say, like, what's this about, right? So there used to be official redlining, right? It was built into the law. It was built into housing covenants and contracts and neighborhood association agreements and those kinds of things. And realtors, had certain practices of sending people in different directions, which they still do. But it was more, like official. But if we look around and we see what neighborhoods look like and what the transitions are in those neighborhoods now, the same dynamics are at work without the same formal structures. And that's why it's so important to look at what's driving it, what's motivating it. What are the real incentives at work here? The incentive is no longer the law tells us to do it, right? And how do we dismantle those? But it's like it's everywhere. So the good news about that is you can just pick anything and go work on it, right? Like, there is no shortage of important work to be done out there. I don't know if that really answered your question. It's like, I don't know how to even come up with how many possible, explanations or examples there could be of that.
A couple more questions. Yeah.
Kwai, I was wondering if it's possible to even have equity when the land is owned. When you think about land ownership, that's the first thing. And like, people can't live where they want to live. And actually I wondered what the way out of that is, because you'd have to give up the land ownership, the property, and you'd have to also give up the money economy that made it possible to keep the land. Those two things, those are for me, are the keys. And like, when, I don't know what the answer is, but I do feel that it's important to shift the way that it's looked upon, so that you don't think that you have a right to own land, that the land itself is its own equal to, and everything on it is equitable to us, which is an indigenous philosophy. So if we were to decolonize, we would have to dismantle that. And how do you see that possibly happening? You know, do you see it could happen from people shifting their mindset and learning other ways of being before the colonists came here? Or, or do you have some idea? Because I know eminent domain, I thought about maybe eminent domain might be a way, because no single person owns any land really. They're all tenants in common or in the entirety. Even land trusts have an ownership capacity that allows the government to come and take it if it so chooses under eminent domain. So I'm wondering about those, and if you see how that could be dismantled, or even how it's possible to have equity with that kind of a structure in place.
Another great question. So many great questions. Well, for those of us in the law who work in this field, right, our favorite case is Johnson versus McIntosh, which is still today the foundation of property law, right? And what happened in that case, to grossly overgeneralize, right? There was one white settler who claimed his land came from the title, came from the British Crown, and the other one said, I bought mine from the Indian owner. And so the question is, who has a legitimate claim? And you can guess who wins, right? But why does the British Crown title win, right? Why doesn't the guy who bought it from the Indian owner win? Well, John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who we know as, Mr. This is a Nation of Laws, he said that to justify this, right, he goes back to the doctrine of discovery. And he says, well, the European nations, right, understood that, the colonizing powers understood that whoever made first contact with the indigenous people had the first right to negotiate with and to, make agreements about buying the land or getting the land. Now, mind you, the doctrine of discovery is an agreement between European powers. It's basically a non-compete agreement between European colonizers, right? It has nothing to do with indigenous law. Nonetheless, the Chief Justice goes back to doctrine of discovery, and then he completely turns it on its head, and he says, well, if the Indian owners couldn't sell it to whoever they wanted to sell it to, they could only sell it to the discovering European power. They must not have really owned it. Because we all know if you really own something, you can sell it to whoever you want. Right? And then he goes, I realize this might not make so much sense, and it might, not seem totally just, but hey, we are, quote, the courts of the conqueror. Okay? So he's basically admitting that this is a matter of raw power, not really justice and law. Nonetheless, it is the law upon which we rely to this day. And if you think about that, right, this was not, in that framing, this land was not property until white people claimed it. The settlers claimed it, the colonizers, right? Because if it had been property, then they could have sold it, right? They would have owned it, they could have sold it. But it doesn't become property until the propertyness of the land is itself a racial construct, is what I'm trying to get to. And that is, I think, undergirding what you're saying, right? Like once we start to peel back those layers, we start to see that this notion of, we can have equitable division of property doesn't really make any sense. Now that doesn't mean we're going to be able to go out there and wave a magic wand and, all the property disputes are going to go away and we're going to own it collectively and take care of it. But it does mean that we can be conscious of the illegitimacy of the very construct itself. And then we can start to think about, that's why I sort of go back to that notion of what's empowering or not, right? Because, it's just a waste of time to think about, well, my magic wand will make it look like this, and your magic wand will make it look like that, and whose is better, right? Because that's not going to happen. But we can start to make change by figuring out what is empowering and how, recognizing legitimate land. Again, ownership's not even the right word, but in this framework, it's hard to find other words, right? Who the legitimate owners of the land are here, and working with them to the extent possible, or figuring out other ways of sort of respecting those indigenous rights and sovereignty, again, to use that concept. And we can think about supporting people who are struggling, right? And that happens all the time, right? Like Standing Rock wasn't the only pipeline struggles. There's pipeline struggles all over the country right now, right? And they have to do with, who has the right to say what's going to happen on this land, and whether it's going to be poisoned by these oil pipelines, right? And is it whoever who has title to that land, or, is there something deeper here about people who have a relationship to this land that goes back before that title, and who consider it not their right, but their responsibility to take care of that land. And so if we start to think more, that's really a key here, I think, is to shift our thinking away from rights to responsibilities, and to responsibilities for the land, to responsibilities to people, to all life, all being, right? And if we can start to do that and to empower and defend those who do that, we at least have a hope of keeping these alternate possibilities alive.
So, last question, unfortunately. I saw this lady just started before you went silent. There might be time to obviously speak as well. Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much. And Natsu, I love the work, and I really appreciate the presentation here. And Matthew is now taking a picture of me, which is very humiliating. But I was wondering, in terms of remedies, and I hear a really strong decolonization thread here. But I was wondering about legal pluralism, and building off of the comments you just made about Johnson versus McIntosh. And actually, for many of our nations, we had property. We had ways that we thought about who could occupy, use, share, alienate lands. So it wasn't that we didn't have it, it's that it wasn't recognized perhaps by the dominant system that displaced it, per Patrick Wolf. So I'm wondering if you might just comment about whether you think legal pluralism is one path forward in the United States and perhaps other settler colonial societies.
Yes, I think that's a great way of framing a really important way forward. And absolutely, thank you for bringing that up, because it's not like, oh, everybody just like wandered around sharing things, right? There were very clear understandings about how things should be done. And there's a great book that you reminded me of that I really love called Raw Law by Irene Watson, about Aboriginal Australian law, and how the whole concept of law is so different to our concept of sort of top-down law. But I think that might be really maybe the most viable way forward, right? To think about different legal systems in that sense, right? And systems of ownership and property and relationships and roles of people within communities and all of those different structures, and to accept that there are very different ways of organizing societies, and that they were that there were long-standing traditions, right? Really complex, really well-organized, and multi-layered, and taking into account all sorts of possibilities and how to cope with change and all of those sorts of things. And so that, recognizing that, right, as legal systems, other legal systems, and then seeing how to work with them, maybe eventually not in a hierarchical manner as we now have with, federalism, seems like an ideal way to envision moving forward to me. You're going to write that book, right? Oh, you already wrote it. Yes, it's true.
So, folks, before I ask you to join with me in thanking Professor Saito for such a dynamic talk and provocative discussion, I'd remind those who are here that the symposium starts tomorrow morning, bright and early. And with that said, I just ask you to join with me and thank our speakers.